faith, fear, and the birth of violence. People often think violence begins with hatred. It doesn't. It begins when thinking is replaced by obedience. No one is born wanting to kill for an idea. They are taught that the idea is more valuable than a life. Religion was never created to destroy, but when belief stops questioning, it starts demanding. Demanding silence, demanding loyalty, and eventually demanding blood. This is not a story about faith, it's a story about power. And what happens when meaning becomes a weapon? Part 1. On faith, power, and the conditions that give birth to violence. This work begins from a refusal. It refuses to compare belief systems as if they were competing doctrines in a market of truths. It refuses to test faith as though it were a hypothesis awaiting verification. And it refuses, above all, to ask whether religion is necessary. These questions distract from a more urgent problem. The real task is to understand why violence carried out in the name of faith emerges again and again, in different geographies and under different names, yet with strikingly similar patterns. What becomes visible when history is examined without reverence is this: religions do not arise in periods of balance. They are born in moments of fracture. They appear where social structures are already damaged, where distribution is unjust, where survival is uncertain, and where the future has lost clarity. In such moments, religion does not merely console, it organizes. It intervenes as a regulatory force, promising order where disorder reigns. Yet this regulatory function carries an internal contradiction. Societies are dynamic. They shift, transform, and reinvent themselves under pressure. Religions, once institutionalized, resist this movement. Their structures harden. What once responded to collective demand begins to defend stability for its own sake. Over time, belief systems that emerged as answers to suffering become tools for preserving the conditions that reproduce it. Those who already control material power rarely hesitate to convert belief into another instrument of utility. Faith, like labor or land, is drawn into the logic of benefit and control. Religion becomes political. It becomes economic. It becomes strategic. And when belief is weaponized in this way, violence ceases to be an accident. It becomes functional. Religious terror does not flourish in isolation. It grows in environments where distribution crises are intense, where inequality is normalized, and where imposed global arrangements deepen local instability. Under such pressures, entire populations are shaken. The rise of religious violence in these contexts should not surprise anyone. For people offered no alternative path, faith becomes both refuge and weapon. For those who recognize this desperation from above, faith becomes an efficient means of manipulation. Belief systems touch a vulnerable core of the human condition. They speak directly to fear, hope, guilt, and meaning. Those who understand this vulnerability rarely waste the opportunity. Narrow corridors are built for ordinary people, corridors with few exits. Religion is steered into politics, commerce, and identity. Projects dressed as cultural synthesis or civilizational defense reveal the same logic: belief redirected toward power. The hostility directed at scientific thought, at critical reasoning, is never accidental. Figures burned, silenced, exiled, or erased across centuries point to a single center of gravity. The Inquisition was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. It left marks not only on bodies but on the spine of humanity itself. Wherever faith declares itself absolute, dissent becomes heresy and inquiry becomes treason. Today, conditions are being constructed for new regressions. Not only one religion, but many, are being pushed toward their own reenactments of medieval darkness. The consequences are visible. Entire regions bleed continuously. Some hemorrhage slowly, others catastrophically. Yet despite this landscape, one is compelled to hold onto a difficult hope: that humanity can still learn from its accumulated suffering, that it can dismantle the obstacles blocking a more lucid future. The purpose here is not accusation for its own sake. It is exposure. to reveal that violence justified by belief ultimately violates the very principles it claims to defend. No faith, under any justification, can legitimately claim the right to extinguish life. To do so is to contradict itself at the root. Religion is as old as humanity, yet it did not arrive fully formed. Early humans were not born with a system of worship already inscribed in their minds. Belief emerged gradually, differently in different communities. Rules were created within lived experience, not delivered from abstraction. This is essential to remember. Religion was never an end in itself. It was a means, a tool designed to enable collective survival, solidarity, and continuity. Trouble begins when the tool is mistaken for the goal. Across history, beliefs have repeatedly been transformed from instruments into ends. Once this inversion occurs, pressure, coercion, and terror follow naturally. An institution that claims to organize life cannot logically justify destroying it, and yet this contradiction appears again and again. Every new belief system begins as opposition. It challenges existing arrangements, demanding equality, justice, and freedom. These demands attract the marginalized. Over time, movements grow, becoming majorities. But once institutionalized, they face a test: remain aligned with their founding principles or adapt themselves to power. Too often, they choose the latter. To understand belief is to understand that freedom of faith is inseparable from the acceptance of plurality. Just as no single garment fits every body, no single interpretation fits every mind. Attempts to force uniform belief resemble forcing identical clothing onto unequal forms. Some will suffocate, others will drown in excess. Rejection is inevitable. Difference is not deviation, it is condition, and where difference exists, coercion loses all legitimacy. The aim, therefore, is clear: to show, through lived extremes and historical clarity, that religious terror contradicts both human rights and the internal logic of belief itself. Coexistence among differing convictions is not optional. It is unavoidable. Any society that refuses this reality prepares its own descent into perpetual bloodshed. Here, secularism is not hostility toward faith. It is the framework that makes shared life possible. It is the agreement to live together without demanding sameness. To demonstrate this necessity, one must trace religious violence from its earliest forms to its modern incarnations and expose its persistent emptiness. That is where we begin. Part 2. The birthplaces of belief and the logic of obedience. Human beings first seek one thing above all others: continuation. Survival precedes meaning. Protection, nourishment, shelter. These are the primal equations of existence. In early human life, this struggle unfolded under conditions of uncertainty so intense that explanation itself became a necessity. When strength alone was insufficient, assistance was sought beyond the visible world. At first, this appeal was not unified. Protection was asked from one force, nourishment from another, shelter from yet another. Different needs produced different powers. From this fragmentation emerged polytheism, totemic systems, animistic frameworks. Each reflected the material conditions of the community that produced it. Belief did not descend from the sky, it rose from the ground. Curiosity followed fear. Observation followed dependence. And with observation came the most disturbing discovery of all: death. The refusal to accept disappearance without residue shaped early metaphysics. Dreams, in which the dead appeared alive and active, demanded explanation. Thus emerged the idea of an inner essence, a separable presence that could leave the body and return. From this grew the notion of another realm, a continuation beyond physical decay. Once belief took shape, emotion entered the structure. Fear alone could not sustain devotion. Love, rooted in fear but masked as reverence, completed the bond. Rituals were created to maintain favor. Offerings followed. Sacrifice became the ultimate currency. Giving life to preserve life appeared logical within this framework. Yet here lies the first ethical rupture. The act of sacrifice introduces destruction into the heart of belief. To take life in order to honor life is a contradiction that would echo endlessly. When killing is framed as sacred, violence gains immunity. Belief systems did not arise in tranquil societies. They emerged where crisis dominated. Scarcity, instability, and injustice forced communities to imagine frameworks capable of restoring balance. These frameworks inevitably challenged existing power arrangements. In doing so, they required organization, rules, and authority. Divine reference strengthened legitimacy. Opposition became rebellion not merely against rulers, but against the cosmos itself. Totemic taboos were among the earliest laws. Prohibitions against killing within the group or mating within the clan established cohesion. Obedience to taboo was not enforced through police or prisons, but through belief itself. Fear of supernatural consequence replaced material enforcement. At this stage, violence was limited. Love, belonging, and fear formed the core. But as systems expanded, belief became increasingly transactional. Sacrifice promised favor. Obedience promised protection. Over time, exchange hardened into obligation. Every belief system, once institutionalized, faces a paradox. It must preserve the rules that gave it identity, while adapting to a world that refuses to remain still. When adaptation fails, force compensates. This dynamic becomes especially visible in monotheistic traditions. The declaration of a single, absolute truth simplifies metaphysics but intensifies conflict. Difference transforms from variation into threat. When identity is fused with divine election, coexistence becomes fragile. Communities long subjected to humiliation often adopt narratives of chosenness as psychological armor. These narratives heal wounds but also prepare the ground for exclusion. When liberation is defined as divine destiny, conquest can be reframed as justice. Oppression endured does not automatically produce liberation practiced. Sometimes it reproduces itself in inverted form. The emergence of universal religions coincided with the collapse of older imperial orders. Where empires failed to provide meaning or security, belief stepped in. Faith filled the vacuum left by failing material arrangements. But belief, when aligned with power, can serve not only the oppressed, but also those seeking to govern them. The early spread of new faiths often involved persecution. Believers were marginalized, punished, exterminated. Yet persecution itself strengthened identity. Martyrdom transformed defeat into moral victory. Suffering became proof. When a persecuted belief gains power, its memory of suffering does not always produce restraint. Instead, it can generate justification. Violence once endured becomes violence permitted. As belief systems aligned with state structures, they absorbed the logic of administration. Obedience was no longer spiritual alone, it became political. Dissent ceased to be merely wrong, it became dangerous. In such moments, belief loses its original function as a response to human vulnerability. It becomes a mechanism for managing populations. Morality is no longer lived, it is enforced. The tragic irony is this: belief systems born from resistance often become guardians of stagnation. Their foundational challenges to injustice are frozen into doctrine. Change becomes betrayal. Interpretation becomes treason. Thus emerges the figure of the enemy within, the heretic, the apostate, the unbeliever. Violence directed outward eventually turns inward. Purity demands purification. History offers no shortage of examples. Whenever belief claims monopoly over truth, it begins to require coercion. Not because humans are inherently violent, but because uniformity is unnatural. The human mind does not submit easily to total closure. Where questions are forbidden, they ferment. Where doubt is criminalized, it becomes revolutionary. Religious violence, therefore, is not a deviation from belief. It is a symptom of belief hardened into absolute authority. Understanding this does not require rejecting faith. It requires recognizing its limits. Belief can organize meaning. It cannot replace responsibility. When responsibility is outsourced to the divine, human agency withers. And when agency withers, obedience thrives. From obedience to violence is not a long journey. It is a matter of permission. Part 3. Power Crisis and the Sacred Justification of Force. Whenever objective solutions fail, subjective ones rush in to fill the void. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural law. Societies cannot tolerate emptiness. When material conditions deteriorate and rational mechanisms collapse, meaning is improvised. Faith becomes the fastest architecture available. Religious violence must therefore be read not as madness but as a response, distorted, destructive, yet intelligible to blocked pathways. Where economic freedom does not exist, democratic freedom becomes a simulation. Choice turns theatrical. Participation becomes symbolic. And when legal routes for change are sealed, pressure seeks illegal exits. Violence enters history at the moment when legitimate expression is denied. Aggression, often treated as a moral failure, is in fact a biological impulse shared by all living beings. Its original function is protection. Under stable conditions, this impulse recedes and transforms into creativity. Under threat, it resurfaces. When survival is endangered, ethics shrink. The horizon narrows. In societies where injustice is normalized, where law applies selectively, and where the future is suspended, people regress, not backward in time but downward in complexity. Primitive does not mean ancient, it means stripped of alternatives. Terror does not appear suddenly, it is preceded by obstruction. First comes prohibition, then helplessness. Only then does violence reorganize itself as a language. At that stage, terror becomes communicative. It speaks where speech has been disabled. When self-defense acquires ideological clothing, terror becomes inevitable. What is often ignored is that terror is not always born from despair alone. It can also be cultivated from above. Power does not fear chaos, it often requires it. A frightened population is easier to manage than a confident one. Fear fragments solidarity. It turns neighbors into suspects. Thus, terror has two faces. One belongs to those crushed by the system. The other belongs to those who maintain it. States, no less than underground organizations, can produce terror. When violence is legalized through exceptional measures, when repression is renamed security, legality becomes cosmetic. The distinction between lawful and unlawful violence dissolves. What remains is power exercising itself without accountability. In such climates, truth becomes irrelevant. Fear does not ask for evidence. It demands reassurance. And reassurance is most efficiently delivered through symbols, flags, myths, sacred narratives. Religion excels at providing such symbols. When societies are pushed deliberately toward breakdown, rebellion rarely takes a constructive form. Positive transformation requires space. Without space, reaction dominates. Anger searches for familiar structures. Religion offers ready-made templates. It provides identity, certainty, and justification. This is why belief-based movements often surge where secular opposition has been dismantled. They are not necessarily stronger, they are simply available. The danger lies in the illusion of timelessness. Religion presents itself as eternal, yet its interpretations are always historical. Every doctrine reflects the conditions under which it was shaped. To deny this is to deny history itself. Those who benefit from inequality have no interest in encouraging this awareness. They promote the myth of immutability. They insist that conditions are fixed, ordained, untouchable. Change is framed as sin. Obedience is framed as virtue. Thus, belief is transformed into a stabilizer of injustice. The tragedy is not that people believe. It is that belief is used to prevent them from recognizing their own capacity to act. Whenever interpretation is frozen, violence waits nearby, because reality will not stop changing simply because doctrine demands it. Reform emerges as heresy before it becomes tradition. Every transformation begins as deviation. Religious institutions, aligned with economic and political elites, often react to this deviation with repression. Excommunication, ostracism, execution, these are not theological acts, they are administrative ones. They serve order, not truth. As long as faith remains a personal search, its capacity for harm is limited. Once it becomes a governing instrument, it acquires teeth. Violence justified by belief does not arise from excessive faith. It arises from faith subordinated to power. Understanding this distinction is crucial. Without it, critique collapses into hostility, and hostility feeds the very forces it seeks to oppose. The question is not whether belief should exist, it is whether belief should rule. History answers this question repeatedly. Each time belief governs, it demands sacrifice, not only of lives but of thought. And thought, once surrendered, is difficult to reclaim. Part 4. Terror, Authority, and the Manufacture of Fear. Terror is never random. Even when it appears chaotic, it follows an internal logic. It requires continuity, organization, and intention. Isolated acts of violence may shock, but terror reshapes behavior. It disciplines. It teaches fear. For this reason, terror is inseparable from structure. Individuals alone cannot sustain it. Only organized forces, whether clandestine or official, can maintain the rhythm of intimidation that terror requires. Sometimes these forces operate against the state. Sometimes they operate through it. Often, they mirror one another more closely than either side admits. Violence always contains a message, but the meaning of that message depends not on the hand that delivers it, but on the eye that receives it. For those who act, violence may appear justified, even necessary. For those who endure it, violence is never abstract. It is immediate, bodily, irreversible. This is why terror must be understood from the position of the affected, not the perpetrator. When violence is systematized, legality becomes a flexible concept. Acts condemned when committed by the powerless are reframed as order when enacted by authority. The difference lies not in the act but in the emblem attached to it. Uniforms sanitize brutality. Language disguises intent. Operations replace killings. Security replaces repression. In this environment, morality fractures. Religion enters here not as cause but as amplifier. It provides an ethical vocabulary that can be bent to justify the unjustifiable. Sacred texts, removed from context and stripped of interpretation, become weapons. Selective readings replace ethical inquiry. Absolute claims silence doubt. Once violence acquires sacred legitimacy, negotiation collapses. Compromise becomes betrayal. Peace becomes apostasy. The most dangerous form of terror is not the one that explodes, but the one that settles. The kind that normalizes itself. The kind that teaches people to lower their expectations, to accept surveillance as safety, silence as wisdom, obedience as faith. Fear does not merely suppress resistance, it reshapes identity. Under sustained intimidation, people begin to censor themselves before anyone else does. Thought becomes cautious. Speech becomes coded. Hope becomes suspect. Religious narratives, when entangled with power, excel at sustaining this atmosphere. They frame suffering as test, injustice as destiny, obedience as salvation. In doing so, they disarm critical consciousness. This does not mean religion invents terror. It means terror recruits religion. Every era of intensified repression is accompanied by a moral story explaining why repression is necessary. The enemy is described as absolute, inhuman, godless, corrupt. Once the enemy is dehumanized, any action becomes permissible. Here, belief systems are asked not to restrain violence, but to bless it. History demonstrates that terror flourishes most efficiently when fear is paired with meaning. Random cruelty creates panic, but justified cruelty creates loyalty. People endure violence more easily when convinced it serves a higher purpose. This is why terror often presents itself as protection. It claims to defend values, identity, tradition, faith. In reality, it defends hierarchy. The paradox is stark. Terror promises order yet produces permanent instability. It promises unity yet thrives on division. It promises salvation yet requires endless sacrifice. Those who live under terror eventually face a narrowing of imagination. Alternatives disappear. The world is reduced to binaries: believer and enemy, loyal and traitor, pure and corrupt. Complexity becomes dangerous. At this stage, violence no longer needs to be frequent. Its possibility is enough. The threat alone governs behavior. Breaking this cycle does not begin with condemning belief. It begins with dismantling fear. Fear is the true infrastructure of terror. As long as fear dominates, belief will continue to be recruited as its accomplice. And as long as belief is denied the freedom to question itself, violence will continue to speak in its name. Part 5. Interpretation, Control, and the Crime of Thinking. Every belief system lives or dies by interpretation. Texts do not act. Ideas do not enforce themselves. It is always people situated in specific historical conditions who decide what a belief means, whom it serves, and how rigidly it must be obeyed. Where interpretation is open, belief remains flexible. Where interpretation is monopolized, belief becomes a cage. The moment a single authority claims exclusive access to meaning, thought becomes a threat. Questions cease to be tools of understanding and are reclassified as acts of rebellion. Doubt, once a stage of reflection, is reframed as moral failure. Curiosity is renamed corruption. This is the precise moment when violence enters the intellectual sphere. The suppression of interpretation is never theological at its core. It is political. Those who benefit from existing arrangements cannot tolerate reinterpretation, because reinterpretation implies that rules are not eternal, that power is contingent, that obedience is optional. To reinterpret is to reopen the future. For this reason, thinkers are always more dangerous to rigid systems than militants. Weapons can be neutralized. Ideas cannot. The execution of thinkers throughout history follows a predictable pattern: first ridicule, then condemnation, then silence. When silence fails, elimination follows. The charge is rarely framed honestly. No one is punished for thinking. They are punished for heresy, blasphemy, immorality, treason. Labels change. The intention remains. Religious institutions aligned with power have historically served as filters of acceptable thought. They do not merely teach belief, they define its boundaries. Within those boundaries, loyalty is rewarded. Outside them, punishment waits. This mechanism is not unique to religion, but religion provides it with a metaphysical shield. Authority does not merely claim correctness, it claims inevitability. Opposition is not just wrong, it is sinful. In such systems, ethics becomes obedience-based. Good is what is permitted, evil is what resists. Moral responsibility shifts upward. Individuals are relieved of judgment as long as they comply. This transfer of responsibility is one of the most dangerous achievements of organized belief. Once people are convinced that morality is administered externally, violence becomes easier to commit. One does not kill, one obeys. One does not silence, one protects. One does not destroy, one purifies. Language performs the final anesthetic. Yet belief did not begin this way. At its origin, belief was an attempt to understand existence, to locate oneself within uncertainty. It asked questions before it provided answers. It was born from wonder as much as fear. Dogma is belief that has forgotten its own questions. When societies change, and they always do, belief systems face a choice. They can reinterpret themselves or they can enforce themselves. The first path requires humility. The second requires force. Force is easier. This is why periods of rapid transformation produce spikes in religious authoritarianism. Change destabilizes privilege. Privilege responds by tightening meaning. Tightened meaning produces exclusion. Exclusion demands enforcement. The cycle closes. Those excluded first are thinkers, then minorities, then anyone insufficiently enthusiastic. Eventually, even the faithful become suspects. Purity has no endpoint. What makes this process especially effective is its internalization. People learn to monitor themselves. They anticipate punishment. They censor desire. Control no longer needs constant violence. It operates through anticipation. At this stage, terror has succeeded. The crime of thinking is rarely announced as such. It is masked as concern for unity, tradition, or moral health. But unity enforced through silence is not unity. It is stagnation. No belief system collapses because it is questioned. It collapses because it refuses to be questioned. Violence justified by belief is, at its core, violence against interpretation. It is the attempt to freeze meaning in a moving world. But the world does not stop. And when belief refuses to move with it, something must break. History suggests that what breaks first is human life. Part 6. Economy, Inequality, and the Sacred Mask of Exploitation. No system of belief operates in a vacuum. Beneath every theological argument lies an economic reality. Faith does not float above material life. It is woven into it. Wherever wealth accumulates unevenly, belief is summoned to explain why this imbalance is natural, deserved, or unavoidable. Economic freedom is not an accessory to democratic life. It is its foundation. Where people lack material security, political participation becomes symbolic. Voting without agency is ritual. Speech without consequence is theater. Under such conditions, frustration does not disappear, it mutates. When legal avenues for change are blocked, society begins to speak another language. Violence is not chosen because it is preferred. It is chosen because it is heard. In environments marked by unemployment, corruption, insecurity, and humiliation, individuals are pushed toward the edge of endurance. When tomorrow offers nothing, restraint loses its meaning. Survival instincts sharpen. Collective identity replaces personal aspiration. The self dissolves into the group because the group promises protection. Religion excels at offering this promise. But the promise is not neutral. It carries with it an explanation for suffering that redirects anger away from structure and toward abstraction. Poverty becomes fate. Inequality becomes trial. Exploitation becomes order. Injustice is sanctified. This sanctification is not accidental. Those who profit from inequality require narratives that discourage resistance. Religion, when captured by power, becomes such a narrative. It does not deny suffering. It reassigns its cause. Responsibility is displaced from systems to souls. In this way, belief functions as insulation for privilege. The most effective form of domination is not coercion, but consent manufactured through meaning. When people accept their position as divinely ordained, resistance becomes unthinkable. To rebel is not only illegal, it is immoral. This is why periods of extreme inequality are often accompanied by intensified religiosity. Faith fills the psychological gaps created by economic abandonment. It offers dignity where society offers none. But this dignity is fragile. It depends on obedience. The contradiction is cruel. Those denied material agency are offered spiritual elevation. Those denied voice are offered submission as virtue. Those denied justice are offered patience as wisdom. This arrangement cannot sustain itself without force. Eventually, belief fractures along class lines. Elites interpret faith as stability. The dispossessed interpret it as revolt. From the same texts emerge opposite conclusions. One side preaches order, the other demands redemption. When conflict erupts, religion is blamed. Yet the cause lies deeper. It lies in the conditions that made belief the only remaining language of protest. Violence erupts where redistribution is forbidden. This does not absolve those who commit terror. It contextualizes them. Understanding context does not mean justification. It means refusing simplification. The global order intensifies this dynamic. Wealth flows upward and outward. Decisions affecting millions are made beyond their reach. Borders harden for people, dissolve for capital. The resulting sense of dispossession fuels identity-based movements. Religion and ethnicity become rallying points not because they are primitive, but because they are immediate. They require no permission. In such landscapes, moderate belief is not enough. Extremes grow faster. They offer clarity where complexity has failed. They offer enemies where analysis is exhausting. They offer action where patience has become unbearable. Thus, religious terror is not an eruption of the past into the present. It is a response to a present that offers no future. The greatest illusion maintained by power is that violence comes from belief itself. This deflection protects the structures that cultivate desperation. As long as religion is blamed, inequality remains untouched. But belief cannot be separated from the conditions that shape it. Change those conditions, and belief transforms with them. Where people are secure, faith softens. Where people are desperate, faith hardens. This is not theology, it is sociology. Any attempt to confront religious violence without confronting economic injustice is doomed to failure. One can suppress symptoms indefinitely. Causes will remain. And as long as causes remain, belief will continue to be recruited, not as comfort but as weapon. We are not yet finished. Part 7. Youth Crisis and the Reproduction of Obedience. Belief does not reproduce itself biologically. It is transmitted, and the most decisive terrain of transmission is youth. Every system that seeks permanence focuses its attention on the young, not because youth is weak, but because it is unfinished. Young minds are not empty, they are open. They search for coherence, belonging, and direction. When society fails to provide these, belief systems rush to fill the gap, not gently but decisively. Periods of social crisis sharpen this process. When education is hollowed out, when employment becomes unreachable, when dignity is postponed indefinitely, youth becomes vulnerable to total explanations. Partial truths feel insufficient. Nuance feels like evasion. Complexity feels like betrayal. Radical belief offers something seductive: certainty. It draws clear lines. It defines enemies. It assigns meaning to suffering. It transforms personal frustration into collective destiny. For young people denied agency, this transformation is powerful. It replaces humiliation with purpose. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of structure. The same society that denies young people material participation often demands ideological loyalty. It asks for obedience where it has offered no future. In return, it promises honor, sacrifice, transcendence. Violence enters here as initiation. For those who feel invisible, being feared can feel like recognition. Terror becomes a distorted form of visibility. It says, we exist, we matter, we can act. Religious narratives, especially when stripped of historical context, provide ready-made scripts for this transformation. They offer heroes, martyrs, final battles. They collapse time, making ancient conflicts feel immediate and personal. Youth is invited not to understand history, but to reenact it. This reenactment is rarely spontaneous. It is guided. Institutions that benefit from obedience invest heavily in shaping young belief. Education becomes indoctrination. Questioning is framed as disrespect. Critical thinking is replaced by memorization. Loyalty is praised as virtue. Under such conditions, belief ceases to be personal. It becomes inherited obligation. The danger intensifies when personal crisis intersects with collective collapse. Aging individuals often turn toward faith as consolation. Young individuals turn toward it as weapon. The same belief serves opposite psychological needs but produces a single outcome: control. When youth is systematically excluded from economic and political life, belief-based movements become substitutes for participation. They offer structure where institutions have failed. They offer leadership where representation has collapsed. Yet these movements rarely empower youth in the long term. They consume it. Sacrifice is always demanded from those with the least to lose materially and the most to lose existentially. The promise of transcendence replaces the possibility of fulfillment. In this sense, religious terror feeds on stolen futures. It is no coincidence that the most radicalized generations emerge where education is poorest, employment is rarest, and repression is most normalized. Belief fills the void left by abandoned responsibility. Blaming youth for this outcome is convenient. It absolves systems. It personalizes structural violence. But belief does not radicalize in a vacuum. It radicalizes where alternatives are absent. The task, then, is not to fight belief with belief, but to interrupt the conditions that make belief the only language left. Youth does not need salvation, it needs space. Space to think, space to fail, space to doubt, space to imagine futures not already scripted by fear. Where such space exists, belief loses its capacity to harden into violence. It returns to its original scale: personal, interpretive, limited. Where such space is denied, belief expands to fill everything. It becomes identity, law, weapon. And once belief becomes total, terror follows, not as accident but as function. The cycle continues until something breaks it. And nothing breaks it faster than a generation that refuses inherited fear. This refusal does not announce itself loudly. It begins quietly with questions. Questions that systems built on obedience cannot tolerate. That is why youth, more than any doctrine, remains the true threat to sacred violence, and the true hope beyond it. Part 8. Ends, Means, and the Illusion of Sacred Purpose. Every form of terror claims necessity. It speaks the language of inevitability. It insists that no other path exists. This claim is its most powerful deception. Violence justified by belief rarely presents itself as cruelty. It presents itself as duty. The goal is framed as so elevated, so absolute that any method becomes permissible. Means dissolve into the shadow of the end. Ethics are postponed. Responsibility is deferred. Here, belief performs its final transformation. It converts choice into obligation. Once this conversion is complete, violence no longer feels like a decision. It feels like obedience to fate. Individuals cease to experience themselves as agents. They become instruments, and instruments do not question the music they produce. This logic is not unique to religion, but religion provides it with metaphysical insulation. The end is no longer political or material, it is sacred, and what is sacred cannot be negotiated. When ends are declared holy, compromise becomes impossible. Violence escalates not because it succeeds, but because it fails. Each failure demands greater intensity. Each loss demands greater sacrifice. Blood becomes proof of sincerity. In this way, terror feeds on itself. Those who die are not mourned as individuals. They are counted as symbols. Martyrs replace citizens. Graves replace futures. The living are instructed to admire what they should grieve. At this stage, belief no longer serves human life. Human life serves belief. This inversion marks the moral collapse of any system. No idea, no doctrine, no revelation can justify the erasure of human dignity. When belief demands such erasure, it has ceased to be belief. It has become ideology in its most lethal form. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that violence committed in the name of faith ultimately undermines faith itself. It transforms trust into fear, devotion into coercion, community into surveillance. What remains is not belief, but discipline. Yet even here, belief is not the enemy. Absolutism is. The refusal to accept plurality, the insistence that one interpretation must dominate all others, is the true engine of sacred violence. Where multiplicity is allowed, belief coexists. Where uniformity is enforced, belief kills. History does not record a single instance where forced faith produced genuine conviction. It records countless instances where forced faith produced rebellion, hypocrisy, and bloodshed. The persistence of religious terror, therefore, is not evidence of belief strength. It is evidence of institutional fragility. Only systems that cannot persuade rely on fear. To dismantle sacred violence, one must dismantle the illusion that ends can purify means. No future redeemed by terror is worth inhabiting. No heaven built on corpses deserves belief. The alternative is neither cynicism nor hostility toward faith. It is limitation. It is the insistence that belief remain human-scaled, interpretable, revisable, fallible. Faith must be allowed to err. Only then can it coexist with freedom. The final responsibility lies not with belief systems alone, but with societies that outsource meaning instead of constructing justice. As long as injustice persists, belief will be summoned to explain it. As long as explanation replaces transformation, violence will linger. The task ahead is not simple. It demands economic courage, political imagination, cultural humility. It demands the restoration of agency to those who have been taught only obedience. Religious terror will not end when belief disappears. It will end when belief no longer needs to carry the weight of unbearable conditions. Until then, violence will continue to borrow sacred language, and humanity will continue to pay the price.